yes, we must forgive, but reconciliation takes two parties. So if the two parties don't come to the table, then reconciliation is not even possible.
It's not tenable. Hey, welcome to Down to Earth Podcast. We're Jess and Joyce, and we're pastors and speakers and happen to be really good friends.
We love making deep theology accessible for everyone on this podcast, and we'd love it if you join the conversation.
We're also inviting our community of listeners to support the podcast financially this season. So you can become a partner with us on patreon.com/down to earth. As a supporter, you'll have access to bonus episodes, surprise content, and you'll be helping us continue to create content that you really enjoy listening to.
We really value all of our Down to Earth community, and we look forward to interacting with you throughout season 2. Here's to thinking deeply and acting boldly.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Down to Earth Podcast. We're super glad you decided to give some time and join our conversation today about reconciliation.
So we wanted to break up forgiveness and reconciliation, I think, for the important reason that we wanted to distinguish that there is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think that this is both important theologically, but I also think it's important pragmatically on the ground.
So maybe if you haven't listened to the previous episode, which is the episode on forgiveness, we'd recommend you pause, go and listen to that one, and then come back to this, because this is in many ways part 2. And one of the big caveats we put in the first part of this, in the episode on forgiveness, is that forgiveness does not require reconciliation. So let that be like sort of the most important thing at the outset. But that if possible, whenever possible, we would reach for reconciliation. There's lots of reasons for it theologically, that we would want to see this embodied. Primarily, the idea that on the long arc theologically of what we hold to, God will put all things to rights in the end.
Okay, so then I would just jump in here and just maybe bring a little bit of correction. That I think we...
Correction's a big word. I just eyebrows raised.
Her eyes just got really big. I think, though, that the way we talk about it is important. So, well, I would agree that we should reach for reconciliation. Sometimes I don't think it's best to reach for reconciliation. That's not the thing to do. And it's the way that we talk about it that frames it.
Or that we put an inordinate pressure on somebody when it's impossible.
So like an example, Joyce, is like your husband or your spouse is abusing you.
Right.
Okay, so beating you up. And they hear, if possible, you should reach for reconciliation.
Right.
So then they're putting themselves, because they want to do the right thing,
this is an
back
important
into
caveat.
a place.
So I would say if someone's beating you, let's borrow that example, they're not reaching for reconciliation. They are actually violating covenant.
And nor should you be reaching for reconciliation.
That's not a context in which it can flourish.
It's abuse.
Yes, 100%.
You are putting yourself in a place. So all I'm saying
maybe we should do a whole episode on the theology of covenant.
Okay, yeah. Covenant and power.
Oh, I like it. Okay.
So
coming back here.
So I think the way right from the beginning that we talk about reconciliation, I think there's not a pecking order. I think forgiveness, yes, we must forgive, but reconciliation takes two parties. So if the two parties don't come to the table, then reconciliation is not even possible.
It's not tenable.
And it's not because one person is less than or has
it's
less
not your fault
spirituality.
if the other person is not.
Sometimes I've heard stories of where reconciliation came to somebody who had something really horrible happen to them, and I've let me just give you a practical example of this. So I've had friends who have had people killed, their children killed by drunk drivers, and as happenstance had it, they were able to reconcile with the people who did that because the other party came and also was seeking forgiveness, and so reconciliation could happen. But at some level, I think there are other people. You can't
put that on people.
Yeah, you can't say that, you're more spiritual because you've had more reconciliation.
Right. No, I would agree with you. And the other part is, I think sometimes reconciliation is forced prematurely and it's not real.
No, it's not reconciliation. What it is
Going through the motions.
fake.
Yeah. So what we could say, and I think you wrote this on our notes, that reconciliation is the cherry on top of a forgiveness process.
I kind of rethought about that too, because I thought about, like, is a sundae as good without a cherry? No. So then it's not it's not a great
it's
metaphor.
a real signpost, I think, of the kingdom breaking in.
So, I mean, I think there's two sides to ditch. We can say that reconciliation has to happen, and then we force people into abuse and we force weird things. But then I think the other side of ditch is, like, we don't reach for it at all.
Right, which would say we don't believe in the kingdom now. And if you haven't listened to our episode on kingdom theology in season 1, go back and listen to that one. But the idea that there are signposts of what is coming in the here and now.
Right.
So do all people get reconciled? Obviously not. Do all people get healed? Obviously not.
Right. I'd say it more like that. Yes.
There will be no more sickness, and one day there will be no more enmity. Is a word that we would use to describe.
I like you bringing that word back.
Yeah. So being at odds with, or in conflict with, or enemies of, either with the Lord or with others, that won't exist one day.
Right.
And it's that one day that we are reaching for. So when possible, we would invite the full rule and reign of Christ in the now, which would mean sometimes we will get these sightings of reconciliation. Right. That's how I would describe it. So at its base level, reconciliation is a desire to make things right, or to be at peace with a person or situation we have not had peace.
And I think we just say, I mean, at its base, reconciliation is the desire of both parties.
Right. So let's look, think of biblical examples. Old Testament, obviously, the very beginning of the biblical narrative in Genesis, you have brothers that are fighting, and I'm not just referring to Cain and Abel. Like, there is that story, that arc, and no reconciliation, murder. Right? And then you fast forward and you get the story of Jacob and Esau, who kind of were fighting from the minute they were coming out of their mother. They're twins, one grasping the heel, Jacob, usurper or grasper, the one who's always trying to one-up his brother. Mm-hmm. And then he steals his birthright. And I think lots of us know that story in Genesis. But they then ended up having to reconcile, or they didn't have to. They chose to, I guess is a way you could say it. But it's very interesting to me when we were looking at this episode and trying to build our content, I never clocked that Jacob's wrestle with God was the night before he reconciled with his brother.
Right.
He had to work something through with God before he could make peace with his brother.
Yeah.
I think it's really profound.
Yeah, and I think when we think about reconciliation, we tend to think about it as the work of the other person. When I think, actually what we have to be asking ourselves, am I willing to come to the table? So with people that I'm at odds with, am I really willing to come to the table, or am I just doing what is human to go, well, they don't want to be reconciled, so.
Right. Or if they fill in the blank, say sorry, own their crap, blah blah blah, then maybe, right?
Right. So I think a lot of reconciliation doesn't happen precisely because we become the bottleneck. We become the person that decides.
Right.
I'm not, because there is a certain amount of vulnerability that reconciliation takes.
A ton. And that's why, I guess, just let's circle back here to this Jacob wrestling with God thing. I wonder if part of what has to happen is the beginning process of reconciliation in our own lives is we have to be honest with God, or we have to somehow be made vulnerable with God, the truth that's in our heart, so that we can come to the other side of it. I don't know, if we don't work it out there, I don't know that it's ever really tenable or authentic, deep.
Right. So I think you go back, I just know when you read that text from Genesis chapter 32 and 33, there's actually palpable tension in the text. You feel the tension as Jacob wrestles with God, and you recognize that it's emotionally tied to the rift with his brother. You actually can feel that the way that the text is put together.
Well, he got his fight out with God instead of his fight out with his brother.
Right.
And there's lots of layers in that theologically. And then he's marked and has a limp for the rest of his life. He never forgets that he had that night wrestling with God.
Right, which I think engenders humility, and I think it tells us something about reconciliation, that reconciliation never happens without humility.
Yeah. John Wimber, who founded the Vineyard movement of churches, used to say, never trust a leader who doesn't walk with a limp. And I think there's some wisdom there, like the idea that we have owned our stuff or been genuine about something that hasn't been great in us, or we've had some humility that's come to us.
Right, and so like...
And maybe through a situation like this, like reconciling.
Right. I would think it would do us all well to, like, maybe you need to actually make a physical list of this. I'm actually thinking about this myself. Like, with all the people that you are not in good relationship with, I think sometimes it's good to take an inventory of that and say, okay, now, have I just written this off that there's no reconciliation because that's easier? Because it doesn't require, or is it really like I'm actually being fair and honest about it? And there are some circumstances where you say, no, reconciliation can't be had, but am I being the bottleneck in some of these circumstances?
Right. Yeah. What are we avoiding? Well, then the New Testament, you have this this other example, totally different story of reconciliation. So it's not familial, it's not lifelong, it's not being sought by both parties necessarily, but I'm thinking of the story of Zacchaeus.
Right, Luke chapter 19. Luke has actually a little bit of a different rendition of this than the Gospel of Matthew does. Luke chapter 19, verses 8 through 10 says, "But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, 'Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount.' Jesus said to him, 'Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost.'" And I think what you can see here is that the kingdom coming to Zacchaeus' life, the signpost of that is that he was willing to make reparations to people, that he was willing to make reconciliation to the people, or
that
at least to bring his side.
Yeah.
So we don't know what people's response was on the other side.
Right, because he'd ripped them off, so maybe he comes with 4 times the amount of money he stole from them, and maybe they throw the money at him. We don't know exactly what happens, but there is something in the principle of Zacchaeus' posture that indicates this is the kingdom at work.
Right, and I think what it says is that reconciliation always starts with hope. It always starts with hope. If we don't have hope, because I think the hope for Zacchaeus is that there would be 2-way reconciliation there. We can never...
that things could be made right.
Things could be right, but they can't be made right until we, as one side of that party, come and make things right.
And the other thing that I love in the Zacchaeus story is that his posture was generous. So it wasn't, well, I'll say my bit if you say your bit, or I'm going to make excuses because I was poor and I needed the Romans and whatever. He didn't have all his out lined up and his excuse making. He just 4 times the amount I took.
Right, and no strings attached.
Right, this generous, open-handed, I'm going to go and undo some of the damage I've done. So that's the starting point. And I think the fruit in his life, certainly not every person would have responded the same way. And if he ripped off as many people as we imagine a tax collector might have, he might have had a lot of reparations to make.
4 times a lot.
In AA, they, I can't remember what step it is. All the people listening, 4, I think. When you make reparations, you go and make things right that are not right between you and others. And everybody who's been a part of any kind of recovery program will know this is a really, really important step. You cannot skip over it. And I kind of want to highlight it because there's wisdom from the Holy Spirit in it. Like, we want to grow and mature as Christians, but we might want to leapfrog over having to try even to reach for some kind of reconciliation. And I know the caveat we set off the top, it's not always possible, but let's not make the excuse too quickly.
Right.
And maybe do the hard work of setting things right that we know we need to set right.
Yep. Yeah, I often think about AA and think probably all of us would be well served by going through that, because I think it's just good people living.
Yeah, it's a way to grow and become healthier. And then, in Canada, where we are, I know some of our listeners are elsewhere in the world, but there's been a long process in our country with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think the TRC is important. We've talked about it on other episodes. But just even in the title, it's Truth and Reconciliation. And it was to get at what's really happened for Indigenous people and the long tail of colonization and the residential schools. Like, what have they had to live through? Let's bring things into the light. Let's speak the truth and then reach for reconciliation. And sometimes I think when it's formal and it's mandated, I don't know, does it work? Maybe not on every level, but it is a step in the right direction. And so there's something there for us even to learn nationally and to participate in a different kind of reconciling.
Right.
But again, a signpost, when any reconciliation happens, when any owning of wrongdoing happens, we're seeing something of the work of God taking place in the world.
Right.
I guess it's important that we also remember we can't mandate it.
Right. It has to come from people's hearts. So this is not something that we can check off a to-do list. And I think this is really important for those of us that would be action-oriented.
Right.
So I am an action-oriented person. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my feelings. And if I do, it's really problematic. Like you just, nobody wants that. But I think for people that are action-oriented, what we tend to do is we get up in the morning or before we go to bed at night, we make a list of things that we have to do. And if we're not careful, we become achievement-oriented. And reconciliation is not something that you can put in the achieve category.
Right.
It's not something that you can say, and yes, I've checked off my box. And I think this kind of speaks to Pharisaical tendencies, right? Because I think those of us that are doers, we do have the tendency, if we're not careful, to become Pharisees in how we live our lives.
Yeah, or the idea, let's be practical. Okay, well, if I own this and try to reconcile with this person, even if they don't respond well, but I do my part to make reparations, then God will fill in the blank, bless me.
We get out of a grace-filled kind of living, and we end up being legalists, and
it's dangerous and unhealthy.
Yes, and it creates something that is not real. It creates fakeness. And I actually think this leads to hypocriticalness in the church. It's why people outside the church will often say, I think, that people seem not real, not authentic.
Right.
And that's not because I think people in the church are bad people. I think they're trying to do the right things, but I think something like reconciliation must come from the heart. It cannot be a box that we check off.
Yeah, that's really important. And the fruit of it is going to be transformation.
Right.
So if it doesn't lead to some kind of transformation or flourishing, then it probably hasn't been real or mutual.
Right.
I think, this is obvious, but the goal of reconciliation is a restoration of relationship. And I think that that's the fruit, if you will, on a long forgiveness process can be a reconciling of relationship. We talked in the last episode that it doesn't always result in it. But when there's a reconciling, there is never a reconciling without forgiveness in the mix.
Right. And I think probably historically there's all kinds of examples of people that were able to see forgiveness that turned into reconciliation.
Right.
An example of this, and I was just reading this afternoon, is Corrie ten Boom. And I don't know, I feel like her story was like a bigger iconic thing when we were kids.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure if all our listeners would even know who Corrie was.
So she's a lady that wrote a book called The Hiding Place. You might have read it in grade school. She
one of the most famous Christians that ever lived.
Yes. Survived. She lived a long time. She was a Dutch lady.
Yeah, survived the concentration camps.
Yeah, she hid Jewish people, hundreds and hundreds of people. Yeah. Then went to this concentration camps, was humiliated and almost killed, but she lived.
And her sister died.
Yeah. And she then became kind of this Christian spokesperson for what it meant to be Christian in the middle of horrific times.
Suffering, yeah.
So and then in 1947 in a Munich church, she told the German audience that God forgives.
Can you imagine?
So she said, when we confess our sins, God casts them into the deepest ocean, gone forever. And after her presentation, she recognized a man approaching her. And it was one of the guards that was in Ravensbrück, which was the concentration camp she stayed in. And this was a guard that had seen her walk naked. That was basically, if we're saying it at base level, like a terrible...
An enemy.
Yeah, an enemy. And at the end of it, he says to her, a fine message, Fräulein, and how good it is to know that all of our sins can be tossed to the bottom of the sea. And then he extended his hand. And she realized that in that moment that she'd spoken very glibly about forgiveness. And she didn't give him her hand. And she thought all of a sudden, maybe he didn't remember me. Maybe he's just... And then he admitted, I was a guard there. But he said this, but since that time I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me from the cruel things I did there. But I would like to hear it from your lips as well. Talk about, I was reading this and thinking about how reconciliation will often cause us to have to really...
dig deep.
And humble ourselves. Like this man, at some level, knew that God had forgiven him, but he knew that it was important to reconcile himself.
If possible.
Yeah. And probably not to all the people, but particularly to her. And she stood there for a moment, she says, unable to forgive. And as anger and vengeance raged inside of her, she remembered Jesus' death for this man. So how could she refuse? But she lacked the strength. And I think this is
important for us to learn from her.
She silently asked God to forgive her and help her to forgive him. As she took his hand, she felt the healing warmth flooding her body. And she said, I forgive you, brother. She cried, with all my heart. And then, so she later recalled, I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on God's. And I think this is the truth, that reconciliation never comes because of our goodness.
Right. And the important thing I hear as well in Corey's writing is that she had a palpable experience of the Holy Spirit when she was willing to own her own sin or her own hardness of heart or her own deep trauma and pain,
right,
which wasn't her fault, but she could own her incapacity to forgive me for this, Lord. And then I just think it's a profound telling of what it looks like in the worst of circumstances. And I don't think, I've read many things that she's written. I don't think you could say that Corrie ten Boom lived a superficial, minimizing, glib walk with Jesus.
Right.
But she could own that even she trivialized forgiveness and thought it was easier than it was, and that forgiveness and reconciliation for her weren't tethered until that moment.
Right. I think we also have to address the idea of what does it mean to be reconciled? Does that mean that you go back to being BFFs with somebody who... No, and maybe not. I think we have to understand that relationship doesn't always mean friendship. Reconciliation doesn't always mean friendship. And you can be reconciled to somebody. Like, was Corrie ten Boom having,
dinner with the guy or being
going on vacation to Hawaii with this guy? No.
It might have been that one encounter and then never again.
And I think you can be reconciled to people that you don't hold as much trust with.
Right, or you don't have to journey with them.
Yeah. So I think we can't have unrealistic pictures and expectations of what reconciliation is. I think that gets us into very dangerous territory if we do. And I think we will constantly deal with shame if we don't actually call it what it is. I think if you've had an estranged parent and then you somehow come back, you have reconciliation with them, that doesn't mean that now you're calling them 3 times a day.
Right. Yeah. And there's parts of my own story. This is a sobering episode for me because there's people that in my own family narrative that I'm not reconciled to. And you wish, but you don't know, will you ever see that this side of the kingdom? Maybe not. But we pray to God and we know that in 2 Corinthians 5:18, Paul talks about us being ministers of reconciliation, that maybe there's a way we can embody reconciliation, not in every relationship, but in some.
Right.
And that's always been really important to me, that, okay, maybe I can't reconcile some of these real things, and maybe they're not relationships that are healthy enough to withstand that kind of honesty. But that doesn't mean I can't be a part of the reconciling of others to Christ and the reconciling in their stories. And honestly, I've had so many experiences where people have come to Jesus and then had reconciliation. Even just this week, somebody sent me like a live feed video for a fellow that I knew in the downtown east side who died. And quite miraculously, there was a conversation in Stanley Park last summer with a person from his church who then realized these were estranged family members visiting from Alberta. It was a wild story, a God story if ever there was one, that set in motion him reconnecting with family members he hadn't talked to in decades. And this came for him not many months before he passed away. I think that's the kindness of God in his life, and probably for all of them and their family. So somehow we can be ministers of reconciliation. And I wish I could describe how profound it is. Probably the most extreme story, I think I told you this the other day, is a bunch of years ago, I knew a fellow who died, and I became friends with his wife. And fast forward some years later, their one son was murdered. And some time went by and I ran into her. And this is a woman who loves the Lord, and has had so much sorrow upon sorrow. So she's alone in the world, and just, you think that can't be easy. And so I ran into her in the grocery store, and I just started chatting to her, asking how things were going. And she said, the Lord's done a really marvelous thing in the last couple of years. So I just thought, well, I got to know, what? So she'd started going to a homicide survivors group. I didn't even know these things exist, but for family members who've had somebody killed in their family. And she said, I went to this dinner and I found out that I could pursue a reparative justice process. So she could go in and meet the fellow in prison who had committed the crime of killing her son. And I just said, were you able to do that? And she said, I was. It was a long process, and a lot of work had to be done before I could go, and they had to be willing, and on it went. But she did go through this process, and it was very positive in her life. But the profound thing was, then she was at a dinner, Christmas dinner, with her survivors group, and she told them what she had done and what this process had meant for her and how it had been very healing for her. And somebody said, I don't know how you could even do that. And she said, I couldn't, but Christ in me could, and began to describe what it was like to know Jesus and to be transformed. And so even her literal story of reconciliation was an announcement and invitation to others to be reconciled to God, to do in them what they couldn't do themselves.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And hard, and I'm not saying that to say, okay, every person who's had somebody murdered has to then seek this same process that my friend did. I wouldn't put that one size fits all.
Right, but I think it is a signpost of the kingdom. And I think what we remember in all of this, what we have to remember, whether we've had reconciliation on all occasions or not, is that people are walking around with all kinds of pain.
Yeah.
And we must be gentle with each other.
Yeah.
And we mustn't put, I think as the people of God, we have to, we want to encourage people towards forgiveness. We want to encourage people to that, but we also don't want to perpetuate false narratives. So like the woman whose husband is beating her, we don't want to push them towards false reconciliation so that they get the reconciliation badge. And it's not really
a
badge.
Yeah.
It's not authentic.
But when it can be authentic.
It's beautiful.
And that's the thing I think, everybody who knows anything about kingdom theology, we would always say there's this tension, the already and the not yet. And so if you're like me listening and you've got a lot of not yet in your story, me too. And so we can just pray and ask Jesus to help us. If there's possibility, if there's a way, if there's anything in us, wrestle it out with God.
Yeah.
And then if in this lifetime there can be reconciliation, that the Lord would make a way for that. And if not, that we would be at peace. I think this is we're going to see about putting in a song here at the end, written by our good friend Tom Weist. Callum and I have known for a lot of years. It's taken directly out of Ephesians 2, verses 14 to 22, that all things are reconciled through Christ and that He's our peace that breaks down the dividing walls. And there's nobody else that can do that. We can't muster that up in our own strength. So I guess our encouragement would be, let's lean into Jesus, wrestle it out, and see if we can find signposts of reconciliation in our life and the world around us. And honestly, if you have a story of reconciliation or something that's come from this episode today, we would love to hear it. Please write to us and let us know. Down to Earth, you can get us on all your social media feeds, but also dtepodcast@gmail.com. And we'd love to see if there's some God stories emerging.
Until next time.
Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or go to our website at
www.downtoearthpodcast.com. Feel free to leave us a review wherever you find your podcasts and spread the word.